Bom dia para todo mundo. Prazer estar
Bom
aqui com
dia.
vocês. Oi, Fred, bom dia. É um prazer estar com todo mundo aqui presente neste nosso encontro do programa de dados do Dia do Ar. Peraí, bota tudo no mudo. O pessoal entra aqui, eu vou botando no mudo, gente, para não escapar o som. Bom dia novamente para todo mundo. Prazer ter vocês com a gente no programa de dados do Dia do Ar. Para quem não me conhece, eu não tive o prazer de conhecer ainda, eu sou o João Paulo, JP, da ABCR. A ABCR é a instituição que lidera o Dia do Ar aqui no Brasil. Junto comigo trabalha também a Carol, que com certeza a maioria de vocês já conhece e teve até o prazer de visitar muitos de vocês recentemente. E a gente vai ter hoje a nossa reunião, uma reunião até tradicional. Todos os anos a gente se encontra para fazer essa reunião do programa de dados do Dia do Ar. Uma coisa muito importante para a gente nesse processo de promover a generosidade no Brasil é entender o impacto que o nosso trabalho causa na sociedade, entender o que significa na prática promover a generosidade e como ela se expressa a partir do trabalho do Dia de Doar, né? Então, nós temos uma preocupação, inspirados que somos também pelo trabalho do Giving Tuesday, nós temos uma preocupação de muitos anos de tentar entender os dados, tentar entender o comportamento das pessoas em razão do Dia de Doar e como é que a gente pode estimular ainda mais as doações e a generosidade no Brasil, estudando os dados das doações, estudando o comportamento das pessoas na doação. Então, há muitos anos no Brasil, a gente tem um programa de dados do Dia de Doar. A gente geralmente faz parceria com empresas que processam dados de doações. Esse ano, a gente está ampliando o programa de dados para trabalhar também com as campanhas comunitárias. Temos um parceiro institucional, que é a Fundação José Luiz Egídio Setúbal. Temos 2 colegas da Fundação que estão aqui presentes, nos acompanhando também. E a reunião de hoje, a ideia da reunião de hoje é a gente discutir o programa de dados do Dia do Ar, mas antes conhecer o que está acontecendo no mundo, está sendo liderado pelo Giving Tuesday. Lá fora, esse programa se chama Data Commons, né? É um programa que tem produzido conhecimento muito relevante sobre doações e generosidade no mundo, para além do próprio Dia de Doar. O programa do Data Commons tem feito um trabalho agora permanente, constante, de compreensão da doação e da generosidade no mundo. Tem produzido relatórios e por aí em diante. E quem lidera esse trabalho é o Woodrow, que está aqui presente, que em breve eu vou pedir para falar. A nossa primeira parte da reunião hoje é em inglês, né? A gente não conseguiu, não tem a escritura aqui, não consegue ter a tradução simultânea, então eu vou pedir que vocês se dediquem, né, se esforcem para conseguir entender o máximo possível o inglês, mas ao final a ideia é que o Woodrow faça uma fala de 15 a 20 minutos, a gente tem tempo para perguntas e respostas, se quiser, e após o encerramento da fala dele, ele vai se despedir da gente, nós vamos continuar entre nós falando do programa de dados. Aí eu e a Carol vamos falar do que está sendo pensado no Brasil para este ano no nosso programa de dados. Então, uma primeira parte em inglês, mais rápida, para vocês conhecerem o que tem acontecido, e depois a gente fala entre nós aqui no Brasil, tá ok, gente? Qualquer dúvida, coloquem no chat, e eu vou passar agora para o inglês para falar com o Woodrow. O Woodrow lidera o programa de dados no Giving Tuesday, tá bom, gente? Esse é o posto principal dele, então tudo que ele vai apresentar é parte da liderança do trabalho dele na equipe do Dia de Doar, do Giving Tuesday, que ele faz parte já há pelo menos 10 anos, quase desde o início do Giving Tuesday. Então, vou passar para o inglês agora, tá bom? Hello, everyone. Hi there, Woodrow. I don't know how much of this you got, but
I got Giving Tuesday and Data Commons. So my Portuguese is getting better.
Perfect, no problem at all. I was just introducing, introducing the program here in Brazil, introducing yourself, sharing with everyone how it's going to be this morning. We have your first speech here and some time for Q&A, and then we will carry on talking amongst ourselves about the program in Brazil. So without further ado, I will share you the floor so you can make your presentation. I have introduced yourself to everybody, so feel free to go ahead and share what you have brought us. I'm sure everybody's excited and to get to know you and the work you've been doing.
Great. Well, I will get started. Thanks for that, JP. And I'll try to speak slowly. Got a few slides to get through here, but feel free to interrupt or put any questions in the chat. But as JP said, we'll have some time to discuss as well. So my role at Giving Tuesday is Chief Data Officer. So I measure Giving Tuesday, but also manage our work around the world. Giving Tuesday is a day, I think probably everybody knows that much. It's a day where the world comes together to celebrate generosity, but it is also a global movement to build capacity in the social sector, to improve communities and help those who are working to support civil society with best practices and understanding and peer learning to advance their work every day of the year. The mission at Giving Tuesday is to bring about radical generosity, radical meaning at the root. And the idea here is that if we're successful, then generosity will be at the heart of the institutions, the societies, and the communities that we create. And to do that, Giving Tuesday works with our partners around the world to learn about what gets that job done. And that's my job. There are, I think we're actually at like 87 or something as of yesterday, 88 official Giving Tuesday countries. Brazil and Canada, where I live, we're the old timers now. We've been around since nearly the beginning. And it just continues to grow really rapidly. The Data Commons, my work, is a component of that overall kind of capacity building and peer learning, where our theory of change for the data work is that if we can empower the individuals, the groups, the organizations who are trying to make change with the information, the actionable insights about their work and their environment and the needs that they're serving, that if they get those data flows, that they will be able to create resilient, thriving communities. And we have some pretty big ambitions for the Data Commons. We want to enable dramatic increases in individual giving. We want more giving, more of the time, all of the places. We want a social sector that isn't just surviving, but is actually thriving. So we want effectiveness, we want resilience, we want agility for this, not just the nonprofit sector, although the nonprofit sector being a really critical component of that overall social sector. We want to support social innovation. I think there's some really interesting opportunities, particularly in Brazil, and part of what we're trying to do there is provide the kind of data architecture that exists for other sectors of where innovation is needed. We're trying to provide that for companies, organizations, and groups who want to advance and experiment and bring new practices. And to do that, you need to understand whether you're having an effect. And critically, we want to increase the agency of givers, because as I'll talk about in a moment, we don't count most giving anywhere. Most givers are not considered when we measure giving. And as a result, this means that the giving of a shrinking pool of ultra wealthy people, their giving matters more and more and more, because that is the giving we're counting increasingly. And so those people just end up with more of a voice in how problems are solved and how the social sector organizes and how nonprofits practice. So we want to give more agency to all of those grassroots givers who are very prolific. And to do that, we need to know what they're doing. We have a bunch of research partners. We actually work with about 70 academic institutions, but these are the ones that we have the kind of closest relationship with. And we've just actually brought on an academic research liaison team to bolster this work and to support more researchers on our platform. So I'm going to share some of the data that we have. Some of this is US based, but illustrative. Some of it's global, got a little bit of Brazil data, but I'll try to sort of provide an overview of what we're seeing a lot of places around the world. With respect to donations to registered organizations, the typical trend, and we can't measure this well everywhere, very strongly clear, very clear in the US and in Canada, in the UK. But this is something that we're seeing at least indications of in a lot of places, is that fewer and fewer people are donating to nonprofits. So we're seeing less participation. And in the US, this has been really stark lately. Multi-year decline in the number of people who are giving to charity, giving dollars to charities. One exception was 2020, when we saw an increase, and we saw this increase many places around the world. There's a whole other presentation about that. It wasn't just quite crisis giving. It wasn't the same as what happens when there's a natural disaster and people flood in and support something and then they're gone. It was like a one-off thing. There was a lot more nuance to what was happening in 2020. And it's really important actually that we look back at that, I think, to see what was working to reverse that long-term trend of fewer donors. Nevertheless, we are back to that trend. And we're hearing this now from other countries as well, that this trend has continued quite strongly. There's a number of things driving it, but it is really important because when we see economic downturn, the organizations that have a broad base of support, including from small grassroots donors, are far more resilient. And it's the wealthier donors who are actually more responsive to those economic downturns. So if you want to be resilient through a recession, you need a broad base of support. And yet we're getting exactly the opposite. And there's a number of drivers of that, including just the fact that a lot of organizations are under stress. So if you need a lot of money next month, then you try to get a few people to write you some big checks. But that doesn't prepare us well for the future. And so some of this, we need to identify some ways of reversing this. So we've been looking at, so what's the broader picture? We know that people are doing lots of things. We don't really have a good idea of what those are. We've got this decline that's really concerning. So what's happening? And so we've been looking at some of the assumptions that are being made in the social sector. Some of this is a little bit US skewed, as you'll see, but I'll get into this. And we've been picking apart some of these assumptions. So the first assumption is that the sort of primary mode of giving is money. And it's been interesting to see that, in some places, I think there's a better understanding that kind of grassroots giving is not always monetary, and there's probably a better understanding in Brazil that that's the case. But the fact is, everywhere in the world, almost everybody gives, and they do so in multiple ways. So what we saw is that overall, like 3/4 of acts of generosity don't involve money at all. And giving in only one way is exceedingly rare. So in Brazil, we see this skew towards giving things, right? Giving things as opposed to money or time, we found was the most common behavior. What surprised a lot of people was that's true in America as well. So the two environments are when you're more inclusive about who you ask and how you ask, what we find is that the differences between places are a lot less distinct than you might have expected. Now, there's the giving things and money are more closely related in the US than we found in Brazil. But in both places, what we found is that it's rare that somebody does only one thing. Everywhere in the world, every time we measure, what we find is that most people are taking more than one type of action. So we've been looking then at, you know, kind of how do we break this down? We're building new mechanisms for measuring more granularly how people are giving. So when we look at how when people are giving things, what causes do they support? Finding that there's a little bit of difference there in terms of the causes, but it seems to be driven primarily by what the opportunities are to give things as opposed to the cause area that somebody tends to care about. People are pretty prolific actually with the causes that they care about, but not all organizations can accept stuff. Similarly, when we look at giving of time, volunteering, is really interesting to track this through COVID, because what we saw very strongly in the US, where we got really good data, and then a little bit more in aggregate and less fidelity where some of our partners measure it elsewhere in the world. But what we saw was this huge drop off in early 2020. The lockdowns came and nobody was volunteering because all those opportunities just vanished. What was fascinating was how fast it recovered. And not only that volunteering actually recovered to above the 2019 baseline before the end of 2020. Partly, I think, due to the fact that there were just more opportunities because organizations pivoted to virtual volunteering. Now, not all organizations could benefit from that, but what it did was open up a lot of opportunity, and people were highly primed to take action. It's one of the actually positive legacies of COVID was it got a lot of organizations finding new ways to engage their supporters. And then the other thing we've been looking at is advocacy, which is really important because I think often we don't think of this as a generous action, but givers, and particularly the younger they are more likely to consider giving their voice as one of the ways that they recognize they can benefit the organizations they support and the causes that they support. And there's a very high correlation between being an advocate and doing other acts of good. So just like volunteering and donations are related, being people put their money where their mouth is. And we do see some variation in the kind of causes that are supported, but again, it tends to be related to, well, there's two factors. First, it, just like giving things, tends to be related to sort of where the opportunities are to be an advocate. Some organizations ask people to advocate. Some engagements tend to be on social media, that kind of thing, and so they lend themselves more toward that advocacy. And then also there's a little bit of a demographic skew here because what we see is that younger adults are more likely to be active in social media, and they're in an environment where they're more likely to say something nice about a cause that they support. So another assumption that we're looking at is that people generally give to nonprofits. Now, this is a very kind of global North US centric assumption. In fact, in some of the places, what's interesting is that there's an assumption, the opposite assumption. You know, we talk to folks in Mexico and in India, and what we hear is, oh, nobody trusts nonprofits. They don't want to give to nonprofits. And there's some truth to that, but it's a little more nuanced than that. Nevertheless, I think there is an attitude that giving to nonprofits is the kind of more and most important way that people can give. But 2/3 of generosity doesn't involve nonprofits at all. And so if we're only thinking and measuring that kind of nonprofit giving as the thing that matters, then we don't get a full picture. And if we don't have a full picture, we're not going to be good at getting people to do the thing we want them to do. And also we're discounting the ways in which they take care of their communities. These are not separate behaviors. If people are taking care of their community, they need food banks less. And if we approach a donor thinking I need to convert them from that behavior to something more important, we're not validating the ways that these people are already prolifically generous. We'll get a better result if we approach people with the assumption that they are already actively generous people. So we've been building these models to look at kind of how people deploy their giving, looking at giving to registered charities, giving to just directly to individuals, and giving to structured organizations that aren't necessarily incorporated, like mutual aid networks, which is very common. And in each country, what we see is that there's a bit of a different skew depending on where you are. Sometimes it's more toward the sort of registered organization, sometimes more toward individuals, and others it's more towards structured mutual aid. In Brazil, it's actually pretty evenly distributed. And everywhere we looked, it was everybody's doing most of these things. So it's the minority of people that are only giving through one mechanism, nearly everybody giving at least through two, most people giving all three ways. And we can look at this by the type of giving. So when we look at Brazil, we see that, whether you're giving money, items, time, or advocacy, there's a little bit of a difference in terms of whether you're likely to do that through a registered charity or likely to do that through a structured but unincorporated entity. But the bottom line is still, most people are doing multiples. They're not choosing one of those mechanisms. And then when we look at the people who are using those structured but unincorporated groups, mutual aid in particular, we see some interesting attitudes. So these people tend to have a higher philanthropic sentiment. Interestingly, they tend to be more trusting of nonprofits, although they also say they prefer to give directly to people in need. So there's an interesting thing going on there. They're very generous. They're inclined to give. They trust nonprofits, but they're preferring to give where they can have a more direct view of kind of the change, the impact that they're having. But interestingly, we saw that if you're participating in mutual aid, you're actually more likely to have donated to a charity or volunteered for a charity than your peers. You're also more likely to have done other generous stuff. And so that experience of the giver tends to be different than kind of what the nonprofit sector's expectation is. It's much more varied and than kind of fixed. So another assumption is that people are just becoming less generous. The thing we care about is donating to nonprofits. Fewer people are doing that, so they must be less generous. But in fact, what we see is that everywhere, well, at least in 21 countries where we've got data, giving sentiment is really strong, and it's quite resilient. The vast majority of people say that they want to make a difference, and that's nice. What's interesting is that they say they want to make a difference. They say that pretty much everywhere in the world. And the degree to which they agree with that statement actually correlates with their behavior. So again, people put their money where their mouth is. The more that important it is, they say it is to them, the more likely they are to actually take those actions. They correlate very, very directly. And we can actually see that some giving behaviors and some actions like participating in Giving Tuesday drive that sentiment up, and that higher sentiment correlates with stronger behavior, or vice versa. We see that things that events that might suppress sentiment, we see that actually when that sentiment changes, we see the behavior change as well. It's been a really clear indicator of action. And that brings me to the last assumption, which we see. I mean, I talked about this with people literally everywhere in the world. Again, not everywhere in the world, 50 countries. This idea that the way people give is competitive, right? If someone gives some money here, then they'll give less there. If they take some action for good for their family, friends, community, then they'll have less for nonprofits. What we find actually is quite the opposite, that giving in one way is the best indicator that someone's going to give in any other way. So 2/3 of people who gave to unregistered groups like mutual aid networks also gave to charities. The best indicator that someone is going to take any action for good is that they took some other action for good. And the people who do things like donate money to a GoFundMe campaign to raise money for somebody's, surgery, those people are more likely to give to charity as well. They're also more likely to say it's important to give. They're also more likely to say that they trust nonprofits. And critically, they're more likely to say that they enjoy giving, all of which highly correlate with actual giving behavior, because it's not a competitive environment. Giving actually is quite generative. These actions don't cannibalize each other. They are mutually supportive. And so what we're seeing is that this decline in fundraising is not driven by sentiment. It's not driven by competition, but we are seeing in the US, at least, fundraisers are asking less. And we know in lots of places that the nonprofit sector, it doesn't ask a lot of people. They don't engage big portions of the population, in part because those people aren't wealthy. But Giving Tuesday really shows what the power and opportunity is behind engaging grassroots givers. On Giving Tuesday, what we see everywhere is that most people take more than one action. So it's very rare that somebody only donates. They usually will donate and do something else. In the US, we saw that Giving Tuesday, even in a year that where acquisition of donors was actually up, we saw that Giving Tuesday was the single biggest driver of donor acquisition for the entire year, even when there were lots of drivers of acquisition. Giving Tuesday participants tend to give in more than one way. They tend to give to more than one organization. They tend to be more loyal and stick around and have a higher long-term value. All of these things are examples of why, when you engage very broadly, when there's many different opportunities and ways that people can get involved, that they will tend to be very generous. And so I think it's important to see Giving Tuesday as that opportunity, but also just to learn from that what we see happening on Giving Tuesday. It matches more the way that people give in their normal everyday lives. It's less transactional, it's more celebratory, it's more diverse. And so we should be seeing what that, and it's not despite that it raises a lot of money for nonprofits, right? That more open, more collaborative, less directly transactional approach to giving actually drives more financial donation, not less. So the lesson here from Giving Tuesday is Giving Tuesday just looks more like the way people give all the time. So we can do that all year round. All right. I think I went pretty quick there. I hope I didn't lose anybody. Got to learn some Portuguese. So we're going to do this more, JP.
No, you're perfect. You actually, considering how good I know you and I've seen you speak before, I thought you were quite clear and slow. I mean, on a slow pace.
That's not my usual pace. That's good to know.
So that I'm really pleased. Thank you, and thank you for sharing. We have a few more minutes, 5 more minutes before we can let you go. So I will ask our friends here if they have any questions. Eventually they can. I'm going to switch to Portuguese very briefly. Just say that.
Go for it.
Pessoal, a gente tem mais alguns minutos com o Woodrow. Não sei se todo mundo conseguiu entender bem. Depois a gente pode repassar um pouquinho o que ele falou. Mais importante para mim é a afirmação de que a generosidade é abundante, né? A generosidade é um valor que eu tenho muito forte. A generosidade, de fato, existe no mundo todo de forma muito presente. Queria saber se alguém tem alguma dúvida que gostaria de perguntar para ele, aproveitar que o Woodrow está com a gente mais 5 minutinhos. Então, vocês podem perguntar tanto em português, a gente traduz, ou quem quiser falar inglês direto, pode fazer a pergunta. Não precisem ficar constrangidos em razão do inglês, tá? Ninguém aqui fala inglês perfeito. Mas se quiser fazer em português também, se alguém tiver dúvida. Alguém tem alguma coisa que gostaria de perguntar?
Bom, para a gente aqui ficou bem claro, acho que o mais importante que eu tiro dessa apresentação é que não existe competitividade na generosidade, né? Então, uma modalidade de doação estimula outro tipo de doação. Se você doa para um projeto, estimula que doe também para outro projeto, porque, infelizmente, não sei se é só no Brasil, né? Mas em algumas instituições sentem que existe uma competitividade relacionada à doação com uma outra instituição, né? E eu acho que, como um todo, a gente leva isso como aprendizado na forma de números, né? Então, que se inicie a ação da generosidade, que seja contagiado para mais e mais pessoas, porque, naturalmente, se você doa para um, você vai querer futuramente doar para outro, né? Então,
Legal.
eu não tenho dúvida, eu não tive dúvidas, mas para mim foi dados bem reveladores de coisas que a gente já sentia, né? Mas que em dados a gente consegue ter essa percepção mais clara, né? Então, foi bem
Legal.
bacana.
Qual que é o seu nome? Eu não sei.
Ah, só Laís, da
Laís, tá
Sinergise.
bom.
Sinergise é um
Perfeito.
projeto. Tá
Eu
bom?
vou traduzir. So, Woodrow, Laís from Synergise and also Doa Curitiba, a community campaign, she was sharing with us that you made very clear to us that there is no competition when you are promoting generosity. Because generosity is, as you have said, abundant, and sometimes in Brazil and in many other places in the world, there's this idea that the resources are scarce and we should be competing against each other. But using data, you actually made it clear that's the other way around. If we are promoting giving, probably will bring even more generosity as an outcome of it.
Yeah, that's really, and it's really critically important that we dispel that myth about competition and scarcity, because the problem is that if we've got the majority of these sector actors behaving as if we're in a scarcity environment and they need to compete, then they get the very result that, right, they end up creating that problem. We end up with less giving because it's so limiting. And then that reinforces this idea that we're in a scarcity environment. But yeah, the data really don't bear that out. And when as soon as we break out of that, it opens up all kinds of possibility.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? Alguém mais?
Can I just stay in the topic of the competition of the donation, Woodrow?
Please, André.
Just to ask you a question, because when we did a research with some users about what could make them do not donate, we saw that most people who donate for churches in Brazil say that could be a reason for not making a donation. So how do you see that? Is church a big player for you guys in Canada? How can you see that? So was, I think, the most reason that for someone to not make another donation, because they already made that donation to the church. And here in Brazil, it's a big player in this market.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the problem is that we often ask donors these questions in the abstract. And so I'll give you another example. At the beginning of the pandemic, as it was clear that it was going to have a substantial impact, there were a lot of surveys went out, saw a bunch of stuff in the UK and US in particular, asking donors about their expectations. And most donors said they expected that they would donate less because they were worried. They were worried about what was going to come, including about the economy. In practice, the more worried they were, the more likely they were to donate. So economic factors on those donors, the reality of those economic factors did have a suppressing impact, but that suppressing impact did not overcome their desire to make change when presented with a compelling opportunity to do so. So yeah, you see a donor. The problem is that so much of the engagement, and we've measured this in a number of places, is so much of the engagement is just not very compelling. It's very transactional. I have a problem. My problem is huge. I'm trying to solve it. You should be a good person and give me money. It's just not very emotionally compelling. But hey, JP, you're an incredibly generous person. I know you're an incredibly generous person, and we're doing this work, and you could have this wonderful impact right now. Is right, like an emotionally compelling approach that includes urgency, JP, what we want to do is have JP thinking about the change he can make right this minute, not whether or not he already did a thing, right? We need to move out of this, because that conversation is all about what is your obligation as opposed to what is your opportunity. And so, yeah, you ask donors that, they're always going to say that, but it's not how they behave when the best indicator that somebody is going to give is that they gave. That is the best indicator that they're going to give. The donor fatigue is a myth. When the 2017, I think there was more disaster relief campaign and dollars into disaster relief it was in September and October. People were saying to me, oh, Giving Tuesday is going to be down because everybody's going to have just given to all of these disasters all over the world in the US. It was not only was it the opposite. The people who had given to disaster relief were 3 times more likely to donate on Giving Tuesday. It is exactly the opposite of what the sector expects. And it's, yes, the opposite of what many donors expect of themselves. But people who are generous give. And the best indicator that somebody's generous is that they gave.
Right. Okay, that's clear for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Woodrow. Pessoal, a gente tem tempo para uma última pergunta. Eu preciso já liberar o Woodrow, queria saber se alguém mais tem alguma dúvida. E, gente, o Woodrow, a equipe de dados do Giving Tuesday é muito acessível também, produzem muito material, então a gente vai circular tudo isso depois, inclusive os slides de hoje também. Mas alguém tem uma última dúvida?
JP, eu gostaria de falar. Dá licença, bom dia. JP, considerando, né, a capacidade de ser generoso como vasta, abundante, considerando que doações menores estão aumentando em relação a doações maiores, o segredo para a gente continuar incrementando, aumentando essa capacidade de generosidade das pessoas, seria mostrar mais o que as entidades fazem, o que as organizações fazem, e assim sensibilizar outras pessoas a contribuírem com diferentes causas?
Perfeito, eu vou. Essa é difícil. Eu vou perguntar para ele, tá? Traduzir com base no que você falou e perguntar para ele responder com base nos dados que ele tem, tá bom? E Adriane, de onde você é? Só para eu também compartilhar.
Jaboticabal.
É verdade, Jaboticabal, eu estive perto. Bem, Woodrow, final question. We have Adriane from Doa Jaboticabal. It's a city in the countryside of the state of São Paulo. And she is asking, considering that small donations and small acts of generosity are growing, and based on the data you have, and this is a little bit tricky, but based on the data you have, what would be your suggestions to foster even more this generosity towards the nonprofit sector within local communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, 82% of organizations that we surveyed said that they used Giving Tuesday to try something new. And at the beginning of Giving Tuesday, I think for a lot, and maybe even still now, for a lot of organizations, like the new thing they were trying was the internet, right? I think what I'd really like to see is more experimentation using Giving Tuesday as a catalyst for collaboration. So if we assume that the data are that the way we're interpreting this data is correct, and that competition is not a problem, that people are very generous and they're doing lots of things, that there's a lot of elasticity in that, then how else can we engage them? Who can we partner with in communities? Can we, if we see that people are giving directly to some cause, how can nonprofits be a partner in solving that same problem, right? So looking at ways that we can work with mutual aid networks, where we can engage people who are giving individually and not say, instead of that, do this, but rather, here's other ways that you can address these same things that you're concerned with. Direct collaboration, I think, outside the sector is one of the ways that we can really take advantage of this. Take this like proliferation of giving and the fragmentation and multiple mechanisms, and take that from being like, let's make that a feature, not a bug. So I think that exploring those partnerships is going to be one of the best ways that we can take advantage of this.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Woodrow. And well, a gente vai ter tchau. We're going to say goodbye to you, Woodrow. Thank you
Thanks,
for
everybody.
your time, for being here with us this morning. Where are you at? In Toronto? Are you at home?
I'm in Toronto, yeah.
Okay, ele está em Toronto. And thank you for your generosity in sharing, Woodrow.
My
And
pleasure.
I hope we can meet soon again. And,
Yes, thanks.
Tchau,
Bye, everybody.
Bye, bye.